Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, African Safari Photography 102, presented by Dr. Court Whelan. Court is NatHab's Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel and has been leading trips for us since 2013. Thank you so much for being here today, Court. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thanks, Kendall. As always, greetings, folks. Well, the big news this week, of course, is I got a haircut. If you're used to seeing me, there's a few inches shorter up there. Other big news, unfortunately, is we've got a very smoky day here in Boulder, Colorado. For those of you that have already reached out to us and checked in, we are doing okay here. But yeah, big fires up in the foothills. So we're vigilant. Thanks for sending all those vibes that you guys have been emailing us. Without further ado, let's get into African safari photography. This is 102. If you didn't get a chance to catch 101, there isn't a whole lot of overlap between the 101 and 102. We're going to talk about a few things that kind of coincide at the end of the presentation, but go back and check out that 101 talk. It's going to give you some other things to add on to this, or rather this adds on to some of the things were discussed before. Simply put, African safari photography it's really the holy grail. It's everything that people want and expect when they think of big wildlife and big charismatic animals and landscapes and the behaviors and the interactions. When people think of safari, rightfully so, they think of Africa, even though in our definition, we talk about Alaskan safaris and safaris in Yellowstone and safaris in Borneo. Those are all technically safaris, but Africa is really what started it all, and it's what in a lot of ways created this wild, amazing, awesome craze for wildlife photography. Absolutely justified. So anytime you go to Africa, you could and will be delighted by just the extraordinary. I mean, I can absolutely guarantee it. You will see some extraordinary things, not just animals in extraordinary ways, but things that other people maybe don't see. It's just teeming with so much life that you are going to see something rare and extraordinary each and every time you go. I can promise you that. When it comes to photography, there are going to be challenges. On a scale of 1 to 10, in terms of the challenging nature of African wildlife photography, it's probably like on the 6 or 7 out of 10, 10 being most difficult. It's not that difficult per se, but there are some special considerations. One is that a lot of your photography will begin the day, at least, in a little bit lower light considerations. So this is one of the things we're going to talk about. What you're going to notice from this presentation is I will be discussing the challenges that might be there, but then also the opportunities, and how the opportunities is actually really the greatest part of it all. I'll take the challenges because they yield such really interesting opportunities. Similarly, we often talk about one of the challenges being the limited luggage allotment we might have. We might be limited to only 44 or 67 pounds, something like that, for all of our clothes, all of our camera gear. But what they offer us is this ability to be on the ground more, on safari more, and when we're in the air, taking some great landscape aerial photos. Drones are allowed in fewer and fewer places in the world these days. We've not yet allowed drones on our trips, but we get a big old drone that we're going to actually be sitting in and you can photograph from. So we're going to talk about how to shoot great photos from planes as well during this talk, because that's a really, really interesting advantage of these flying safaris. So without further ado, and there's of course a host of other things we're going to talk about today during the talk, but let's talk about the gear. We're going to expand on this a little bit. If you've heard my spiels before, you know that the very best camera in the world is the one you have with you. So you can bring anything and it's going to get great photos. But as I like to think, sometimes I don't know if it's the perfectionist that makes the great photographer or the photographer that turns into the perfectionist, but we always seek the bigger and better cameras. You start off in one thing and you're looking over someone else's shoulder and you say, oh, how did you get that shot? We were in almost pure darkness. How did you get that photo? Or gosh, that cheetah was so far away. How did you get that shot? Looking at someone else's LCD screen. So it's natural, it's understandable to want to progress in better and better cameras. So while you can absolutely get great photographs in point and shoots, and like you've heard from previous webinars, there are certain advantages to them, having everything in one compact kit. We're going to go into detail about some of the added gear if you do have a camera with interchangeable lenses. So as you also know, and also pardon my little red arrow, that's going to be used for explaining some of the tips and techniques. Right now it's just kind of in the way, but can't toggle it on and off. It'll come in handy in a few slides. So my go-to gear is a camera body. I shoot on a Canon full frame, and then 2 lenses is really all you need to start off with. Something in the zoom telephoto range and something in the wide angle kind of walking around range. This is going to get you most shots that you want out there. You don't need anything more than this, but of course, a lot of times we like to think beyond this and what might add, what might get you that next level shot. And one of the first things that come to mind with big safaris is those big bazookas, the big prime lenses as we call them. Prime lenses is another word, another way of saying a fixed lens. Fixed lens basically just means that it does not have zoom. It does not have the ability to go in and out. You're stuck at one length. You can't get anything closer, anything further away. You are stuck at 300, 400, 500, 600 millimeters. So you might think, well, gosh, why in the world would I want to bring this obnoxious bazooka that's heavy and hard to lug and hard to fit between the seats to get the shots and all that? Why would I do that? Well, simply put, because the optics in these things, because there aren't a lot of moving parts, because everything's dedicated to this one range and this one focal length, you get the very best quality photos out there, period. So it's worth considering. If you consider yourself a very serious hobbyist or amateur, or you consider yourself getting into real deal kind of pro level photography, it's definitely worth considering. There are usually about 4 or 5 different super telephotos, as they're often called, for each camera manufacturer. This one right here, I think this is probably, you say it on the barrel, it's like the 500 millimeter or something like that. Basically what you can do is get something in the 3, 4, 5, or 600 millimeter range. Bring that with you. It's going to mean you probably bring less, fewer books to read and fewer other lenses, but it's going to be your main telephoto lens. That being said, sometimes you can get away with a little bit less. You can get away with the smaller of these big lenses at 300 millimeters, and you can pick up what is known as a Tele Extender, sometimes called a Teleconverter. And what these are is these are little tiny cylinders that fit right here. If you see my arrow, it fits right here in the barrel of the lens. It actually goes between the lens and the camera. And for this one right here, it's known as a 2x Tele Extender. They can be really, really useful, particularly for these prime lenses, the big ones, because that magnifies your 400 millimeters and turns it into an 800 millimeter. I often get the question at the end of webinars like this of, do you recommend a teleconverter? And I say, yes, only if you're going to bring these big zoom lenses, or sorry, lose my words there. The big prime lenses. There are costs and benefits. They're very small, very lightweight. They don't cost a lot of money. They give you this big magnification power, but you lose light. You lose light and you lose it in what's known as stops. There is a smaller teleconverter out there for all the big manufacturers that's about 1.5 times or 1.4 times. So obviously do the math, 300 times 1.4 versus 300 times 2. You don't get as much, but nevertheless, you do have some sort of sacrifice, a little bit in quality and a little bit in light. The reason I say the only reason I ever think about these is with these big prime lenses is because the quality starts off so high that even bringing it down a notch still makes a really, really high quality photo. Okay, so let's talk about memory and storage and backup and all that. This is quite important because I think most people that are adept and curious photographers, if they've ever been to Africa before, they are going to be undergunned for memory. You're not going to bring enough memory. Make sure you do not make the mistake, because these are priceless memories, priceless photos. If this is your one time to go to Africa, your big trip, make sure you bring 2 to 3 times as much memory as you think you need, and consider bringing some sort of backup device. I often do bring my laptop. You might think that's crazy because we have weight limitations. You're going to be in safari camp. Things are dusty. There might not be enough power. Like, is that really safe? Well, frankly, I prioritize my photos over the health of my laptop. And yes, my laptop has always been just fine. But nevertheless, you might want to consider bringing one of these little storage devices. This is known as a passport, for a Western Digital passport. Stores like 1 terabyte worth of photos. You can dump your memory cards on here and back them up, even if you do keep the same memory cards loaded and don't erase them. Or you can dump them on here, erase your memory cards, and use them over and over again. Just for what I do, if you're wondering, I like to have 2 copies of every photo that I take. So usually every night, every few nights, I'm going to dump my photos onto my laptop, back them up also on a hard drive, and then erase the memory cards and use them over again. So I have 2 copies. That way, if something happens, if I didn't transfer it right, whatever, we still got that. You can't be too safe. Batteries and charger, a no-brainer, not any sort of extreme conditions. So 1 or 2 backup batteries is good. Nothing too fancy there. In contrast to some of our Arctic trips where the batteries are going to get zapped a lot faster, not under too much duress in Africa. Okay, some of the accessories. We're going to go into the next 2 slides here. Do you bring a full tripod, any sort of stabilization? You know, to me, I generally do not. If I bring anything, it's gonna be some sort of small travel tripod for some of the night photos that we're gonna get into in the next few slides. Most outfitters, I know Nat Hab, for any wildlife photo safari that we do, we provide what's known as a camera beanbag. This is essentially just a stabilizer platform that you can rest your camera on if it's gonna be on the metal surface, like let's say the armrest or bar next to you, or maybe you're gonna photograph off you know, the seat rest in front of you. It kind of just stabilizes. So this bandana is kind of my pro tip on if you do not want to use a beanbag, if you do not have one, if you're going with a company that doesn't provide those, it's a really quick hack. I'm just going to show you basically. So here's my camera here. What I'll do is I'll just take a bandana, maybe even a t-shirt or a sweatshirt that I already packed, and just wrap it around the tip of my lens, the barrel of my lens. And that way, whenever I'm setting my lens on something, there's a nice soft cushion that's going to buffer it instead of going metal to metal or plastic to metal. That's really all I ever use. It's, you know, a $2 bandana. It stays on, so you're not having to balance the beanbag and then your camera, and you're risking the beanbag falling over the car. Just a little bandana, t-shirt, sweatshirt, something just tied to the very tip of your lens. That's all I use. Sometimes with these big super telephotos, a monopod is great because it helps stabilize it or at least rest it in the vehicle. You can put that on the floor and pivot around like this. But as you know, I personally am not a huge tripod person, especially when I'm in a vehicle, especially for wildlife photography, because you need to have that flexibility to move side by side. So this is where the super telephoto can be a little bit of a hindrance, these big bazooka lenses, because they don't allow you to be handheld. They don't allow you to move quite so nimbly. So you can see that lens that I have over there is just the classic 100 to 400. That's my go-to. It gives me 400 millimeters. It's not got the greatest aperture rating, but it's gonna be sharp, crisp, and most importantly, handheld. As far as camera protection goes, so the big issue in Africa, of course, is dust. It's not so much rain. Even if you go during the green season when you might get some thunderstorms, they're usually pretty quick. Usually you're not gonna need a lot of rain in the vehicle because they often have some sort of top or covering to them. You can easily put your camera away if you need to. But for dust protection, my go-to is actually a little dry bag. And if you watched last week's Galapagos presentation, I had one with me, and I showed how I would just slip it over the camera real quick. I would barely even clip it, just something like a Ziploc bag would work as well. I advocate for these cheap little thin dry bags because they're infinitely reusable. And that means it's a little bit better for the environment, a little bit more sustainable. They are a little bit more durable and more protective than a Ziploc or some sort of plastic bag that you might buy from a grocery store. And these are really quite great. And you can buy them for the size of your camera and lens. Just something so when you're bouncing around, bumping around, maybe a little bit of dust coming in, you have something that is an impermeable layer between the outside and your camera. Lens will get, or dust will get on your lens. So I bring along a lens duster. This is very similar to like the aerosol things you might buy to clean off your keyboards and whatnot. However, since you can't usually travel with aerosol, this is a hand pump. It's a little squirter. You just kind of blow a very targeted stream of air into the lens. You don't want to rub dirt onto the lens. You kind of want to get the big particles off first and then use your lens cloth to wipe from that point on. If you're really worried about your camera getting dust in it, if it's not weather sealed or for whatever reason you want, some of these lens jackets are quite good, and we do have these on our gear store. Before we go into photo techniques, second camera body, big question. This is very subjective. I often will bring my smartphone as my second camera body, and I will have my telephoto lens on my main camera body. That gives me the wildlife shots on my big fancy camera and the landscapes, travel, people shots on my iPhone, which is pretty darn good quality. Sometimes people have smaller little point and shoots from back in the day. Sometimes people might have a second camera body. Safaris are one of the times where I'd say it might be worth considering that second camera body. If you have one and you recently upgraded and replaced, go ahead and bring that older second one as a backup, and also as a way that you can have your wide angle on one camera and your telephoto on the other camera body. And you don't have to waste time taking the lens off. You don't have to risk dust getting into the sensor, which is very hard to remove even with these lens dusters. You do not want dust in the sensor. Second camera body is advisable, not critical. Don't go out and spend thousands of dollars if you weren't planning on it, but it is very helpful if you have one. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the top photo techniques, the 102 version of African wildlife safari photography. Okay, so what I want to start off with is what are my things progressed a little too fast there. Let me go back here for a second. Okay, great. So what are my out the door settings? What am I leaving my tent in the morning? I want to make sure my camera is ready to go. What are the settings that I put on my camera to make sure when I see that first animal, which could literally be seconds away from pulling out of the camp driveway, it could be on the way to the vehicle, it could be from the lodge boardwalk. What are my go-to settings that I use? Okay, so my main settings, well, I'm not sure why we've got that progression going on. Hopefully it's just a few slides like that. Sorry, guys. So let's see, let's talk about this. So my main camera settings for walking out the door, manual mode, I go for the lowest F number because usually when we're leaving first thing in the morning, it's gonna be a little bit dark, a little bit dim out there. We're needing to prioritize for as fast of a shutter and as low of an ISO as possible. Lowest F number, we're gonna want that for wildlife photography anyway. A shutter speed of about 1/200, and then auto ISO. What I used to use is I actually used to use aperture priority mode, and I would let the camera choose the shutter, and I would set in my ISO. Just for what it's worth, it's very, very helpful these days to put it in manual mode. A lot of these bigger, fancier cameras are letting you go to auto ISO while you're programming the main two things, aperture and shutter speed. Super duper helpful. I make sure my camera's on burst mode. So burst mode is a way of taking many, many photos, the most and the fastest number of photos per given unit of time. Usually it's measured in what we call frames per second, or sometimes it's listed as FPS. You want to have it as fast as it'll go. The bigger, fancier cameras do a lot better with this. You might get up in like 10 frames a second. That is like night and day when it comes to getting that perfect shot, when it comes to getting that certain expression, the way the blades of grass have moved, or as the animal's standing up, just exactly that stretch that you want. So having a burst mode is critical. Evaluative metering is the way that the camera chooses the amount of light that goes in your camera. And then my exposure compensation at 0. This is all going to make a lot more sense here when I talk about aperture and shutter speed and that relationship. I haven't actually gone into the depth I'm about to go into since the original 102 of all nature and wildlife photography. So we're going to revisit that in a couple slides. And I have a feeling this slide is probably going to do the same thing where it progresses very quickly. Let's see if I can get it not to do that. I think it's only for a few slides. If not, I can exit out of this and fix it. My other out the door settings, white balance set to cloudy or auto. I'm gonna want to make sure and double check that I'm shooting on RAW or at least a high quality JPEG. Sometimes what happens when you change batteries, it hasn't happened to me for a while, but when I catch it after I've taken 100 photos for the morning, I'm really, really disappointed if I've changed for whatever reason from RAW to JPEG, or if I've dropped my JPEG quality down to lower. I've had this happen when I'm shooting time lapses and I want a lower quality photo because I'm shooting thousands of photos in succession. Make sure you're on the highest quality and on RAW if you do shoot on RAW. And make sure you have ample battery life and memory. You don't want to have a low battery as you walk out the door. Again, if you see something extraordinary right off the bat, and your memory card, make sure it's pretty fresh, or at least you have a couple hundred photos on it, because if you are on burst mode and you start snapping away at that first amazing sighting in the morning of wild dogs crossing the savannah, or beautiful zebra, lion, whatever you have, make sure you have enough memory that you're not changing your memory card right off the bat. Just some housekeeping things to do as soon as I leave my door, really before I leave my door for the morning. Okay, so let's see. Okay, it did stop there. So we're almost through that annoying little slide progression thing. I apologize. So, okay, now we're gonna get into photographing at dawn and dusk. I've sort of alluded to this, and we're gonna dive into that aperture shutter speed relationship. The issue with photographing at dawn and dusk is that shutter speed is your limiting factor. You have very little light. If we're photographing landscape stuff, we can use a tripod. The mountain's not gonna move, the tree's not gonna move, so you can have a slow shutter. However, if you are photographing lions, any sort of wildlife, and even if they're barely moving, they might just be kind of turning their head or tilting, at that low light, you still have to have a reasonably fast shutter speed, or else you are just not going to get the shot. You're not going to get that frozen action where that tongue's sticking out and that little cuddling action. You want to have a fast enough shutter speed. So how does this all work? Let's go back to the very beginning here, this concept of how a camera works. Okay, so bear with me. This is going to be probably a little bit in depth, but this is going to, if there's anything you take away from this presentation, you're going to understand photography a heck of a lot better as you understand this relationship between the two main things in photography, aperture and shutter speed. So real quickly, aperture is the opening of your lens, and this occurs for any camera that's out there. This is going to be your iPhones, all, you know, to your little Canon point and shoots, all the way to your biggest, fanciest DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. They all work under these two similar principles. One is your aperture. This is your opening that lets in light. So we're looking at the camera side by side. how much light actually gets in through the lens. And there are variations. You can let a lot of light in, you can let a little bit of light in. Then your camera sensor, okay? How long is your camera sensor exposed to that scene? If you want to stop motion and see that lion mid stand up, you need to have that sensor exposed in a very, very short, quick set of time, because you don't want to have that lion blurred as it's standing up. You want to capture that split second moment of time. Usually we're photographing something like 1/200th of a second, that fast. In older cameras, a mirror actually pops up and exposes the sensor. And the newer ones, these mirrorless cameras, they don't have the mirror. They do so through a digital mechanism, okay? So it's this balance, and Canon uses the terminology AV for aperture and TV for shutter speed. But what this means is a balance between aperture and shutter speed. You can't change one without changing the other. And there are, if you look over your camera's settings and menu, there are gazillions of various things you can customize in your camera. But really at the end of the day, going back to the fundamentals of photography, the stuff that Ansel Adams was thinking about, it's really just these two things. You're looking at shutter speed and aperture. So let's kind of use an analogy to explain this a little bit better. So imagine, so you're trying to get enough light in a scene. You know, you could be at the edge of the most beautiful canyon in the world and you want to photograph it, but there's no light. It's 1 in the morning, there's no moon, there's no stars, there's no ambient light on the horizon. It's just a dark scene. You don't have enough light to capture it. So what you need to do is you need to, first of all, think about light in this analogy as like water filling a bucket. You need to fill up light in your camera sensor to fill up this bucket of water. And it's a unified amount of water. It's a unified amount of light. Our eyes have to see a certain amount of light for the photo to turn out. So there's a couple ways you can do it. Let's go on the far right hand first. You can have this big open aperture. This is gonna be like a fire hydrant. This is gonna be like a spigot on full blast. So that means when you turn that on, when you turn the light on, you can fill up that bucket of water in a really short amount of time. Just a quick turn, like you have a big fire hose, it takes you a split second to fill up that bucket of water. It takes you a split second to fill up your camera sensor with enough light. Go to the opposite end, and if you have a very narrow aperture, very small pinhole opening to that lens, it's gonna take you a lot longer to fill up that bucket, right? In fact, it might take a whole second. It might take 10 seconds. So the way we look at it is as this aperture can get more and more open, you can have your shutter speed faster and faster and faster. And then of course there's some middle ground here, like your general, f5.6, kind of on the fringes here, f4 to f8. This means that you're kind of having a moderate, more or less, opening and a moderate amount of time that your shutter is open. And oftentimes most lenses, especially telephoto lenses, are kind of limited in this middle. You can't get to this really, really wide open, and you don't really want to have that super long time for that shutter. Remember, we want that fast shutter speed. So going back to the practicality of this, when we are going out for early morning or late evening photography and we are limited by light, we can't really have our cake and eat it too. We have to have a fast enough shutter speed so that way our scene isn't completely blurred because the sensor is being exposed for seconds. All the light is blurred. Sometimes it's a really cool effect. You can see these, Paris street scenes with the traffic in the brake lights kind of swirling. That's the beauty of that. That's the great effect. For wildlife photography, 99 times out of 100, we don't want that. So we still have to have all this, yet we're often constrained by how wide we can get that aperture. Remember, only the biggest, fanciest, most expensive lenses allow you to open it for full range of light. As a result, so at this point, maybe you digested everything I said. Maybe it was a little bit too complicated. I'll take questions at the end, but let's take the practicality of that into place as to how you can maximize your photography at dawn and dusk. The best way to do so is go into what's known as your exposure compensation meter. And it's usually gonna look like this, either in your camera's menu or a button you push, and then something's gonna show up on your screen that gives you this -2 to +2, sometimes it's -3 to +3, and you can manually use your dial or your wheel or your arrows to dial down a darker photo. So what this allows you to do is you're basically telling your camera you're okay with a half-filled bucket. Okay, I don't need that bucket brimming. It's early morning. It's okay if it's a little dark. My eyes are seeing dark stuff too. It's okay if the resulting photo is a little bit darker because I need that fast shutter speed and I can't open my aperture. I can't get a bigger faucet, right? Your lens is limited by how big a faucet can be. So you can tell your camera to shoot it darker, and this is a really, really good pro tip, a really good hack for a way to get that shutter speed you need at those difficult times of day. Yes, your photo will be a little bit dark, but it's better to have a photo that's too dark and to get the shot rather than have one that's completely blurred and just botched. Also, if you do any sort of photo editing after the fact, you can always lighten a dark photo a lot easier than darken a too bright a photo. So you can actually fix this on the computer pretty darn well. Okay. Oh, and that was going to remind me to say that if you are interested in learning more about this, if you want to have a little reference guide on hand as you're experimenting with this, whether it's on your next safari, whether it's in your own backyard or the state park or national park near you, go ahead and download that now. It's going to be in the GoToMeeting control panel. You can download the PDF, you can print it out, and it's a great little tool to have on reference, and it talks about all this stuff I just mentioned. Okay, so then as we get into this, what is ISO and how does it work? So ISO is this third kind of component. I said there's really only two. ISO, very akin to ASA back in the film days. ISO is magical unicorn, okay? And so what ISO does is it allows you to fudge one or the other. It allows you to kind of start to have your cake and eat it too, because what it does is this is a photo of your camera's sensor. This is the thing that's picking up light. Is it actually sends a very minute electrical charge through your sensor to make your camera sensor more sensitive to light. So you're kind of faking it, but you're allowed to. You should be faking it. You're kind of cheating, but you should be cheating here. It's a great tool. The only downside, as you increase your ISO, yes, you get more light sensitivity. That means you can shoot at faster shutter speeds, while aperture stays the same. However, as you send this electrical charge, as you turn ISO from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 4 to 8, 800 to 1600, and so on, all the way up to 12,800, the photo deteriorates a little bit. It gets what we call grain or noise in the photo. The best way to understand this is to go out tonight or in the evening and experiment with it. Go all the way up to 6400 if your camera can do so. Put it on the computer and compare side by side of a similar shot during the day. Just go outside your backyard. It's very easy to do. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention ISO because it's a very important ingredient into all this, but nevertheless, be cautious with it, because even though it seems like you can take faster and faster photos, you won't see that noise in the grain until you put it on the computer, and then you may regret going as high as you did. So again, great time to download that cheat sheet. Okay, another great thing I love about safaris is the ability to get aerial photographs. So there are two ways. One are the bush planes I mentioned just a second ago. Another way is a lot of times you can get in these amazing hot air balloons for early morning balloon safaris. I know this happens in Kenya and Tanzania, and Botswana starting to do it now too. It's very, very cool. So one of the questions I often get asked, especially as a guide, is, okay, great, we're getting in this balloon. What lenses should I bring with me? You can't bring your whole kit. You can't bring a backpack. It's kind of limited. If you've been in a balloon basket, you really can only bring what's on your person and whatever's in your pockets, maybe a bottle of water, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a couple schools of thought. One is that you can get some really darn cool landscape shots. You can get some beautiful wide angle shots. Stick with your wide angle. You can start to get these medium kind of telephoto shots if you have a medium telephoto, kind of zooming into the landscape. You also have the ability to shoot down from above and get these really interesting, very, very different animal shots as you float completely quietly as like a cloud right over these animals. They just go about their normal business. They don't even really know you're there. And you get these very, very interesting, obscure kind of different photos, but you need a telephoto for that. So what do you bring? What do you have on your camera? And let's not forget my love of this concept of zoom compression. As you take a telephoto and shoot a traditional landscape shot, it makes big things like suns and moons appear bigger on the horizon because you can zoom in all the way to these distant trees and make them look close, make the sun look even closer. So my go-to setup for any sort of aerial photography is gonna be either the left side or the right side. I tend to go for the right side, but as smartphones get better and better and better, their wide angle capabilities are about as good really as some of the big fancy DSLRs. So usually what I do is a smartphone would be good for the wide angle stuff, and then I'll throw my medium telephoto, something that has a little bit of range, into that 105 millimeter in my pocket. Or if I don't have a smartphone, I'm gonna bring my wide angle and I'm gonna bring some sort of telephoto. I'll put the telephoto on my camera, because you can always bring a camera around your neck. That's 100% encouraged. And then just throw your smaller wide angle in your pocket, and that's the go-to. When we're talking about photography from bush planes, it's a very, very similar mindset of the whole zoom versus telephoto versus wide angle, et cetera, because there are some great wide angle scenes to be had. However, you have this other constriction that you are often photographing from some sort of window, right? And while this is kind of a cool shot, it's very much like a put yourself here, look, we were flying in this little tiny bush plane that goes over this beautiful, beautiful delta in Botswana. But really what you want, apart from this experiential put yourself here shot, is you kind of want that classic aerial shot, without all those bars and without the windows. So as a result, I'm actually slightly in favor of that medium telephoto, or even your big telephoto if you have a big range, like 100 millimeters to 400 millimeters, and have that on your camera and gets these great shots out the window. And it looks as if you're flying in a hang glider or a drone, and you can get some really, really quality aerial shots. So, if you've learned nothing else from this, make sure that you do plan on taking photographs from planes when you're on safaris like we do, that do fly these little puddle jumpers from place to place. Wide angle shots you can get from inside the plane. They're kind of cool. Again, kind of a nice travel shot. But nowadays, these smartphones are getting so good. The wide angle capabilities are so nice. I have one lens of my camera in my lap on my person. The rest of my stuff is stowed in the back, and I'm taking shots out the window kind of like this. And I really like these shots a lot. They are great memories. They are compelling shots. They're interesting for the start of a presentation, good backdrops, et cetera, et cetera. So how am I photographing this? Well, first and foremost, you don't have to overthink it. There aren't really any fancy settings you need to consider. Full auto is just fine. Make sure you don't use the flash because it'll reflect off the window, and that's a whole heap of problems. Program mode is something that I advise for a lot of people if they aren't used to shooting on manual mode. I may have overwhelmed some people by talking about manual just a few slides ago. P for program mode is a great way to do it. The camera chooses aperture, it chooses shutter speed, just fine. But if you are a little more advanced and want to be on aperture mode or a manual, just something middle of the road. F8, auto shutter, auto ISO, totally fine. The big line in the sand, the big thing that's going to elevate your photographs is actually a couple of very, very small little tweaks you can do while editing your photo. Dehazing brings out some of those contrasts. Saturation, shooting through an airplane window glass is almost always going to desaturate your photo. And then upping the clarity. So again, you don't have to really understand what these things do, or check out one of my post-processing editing programs that we talked about a few weeks ago and learn more. But otherwise, just check these things out and you're going to see these photos really, really pop. I probably should have done it before and after, but just in short, imagine this photo much more drab. That's what's going to come out of the camera because you're shooting out of an airplane window. Another thing to consider while photographing from the air is getting something to provide context. Yes, this is a beautiful mountain scene in the deserts of Namibia. They're fantastic, these dunes and these craggy sandstone cliffs. It's really, really great, but I think there's something nice about showing this wing of this airplane above. So at some point on your safari, I highly recommend, if you are able to choose your seats in these smaller planes, these 10, 12-seater planes, try to get yourself next to a window underneath one of the wings, and that's going to get you a really cool shot like this. Okay, so we're moving on. Like I said, that low light photography can be a challenge, of course, but there are great opportunities. And one of the things I did not talk about in my Safari Photography 101 is how great of photos you can get of your camp at night. Almost every night, every camp you go to in Africa is going to set up these wonderful, elaborate displays with authentic lanterns and candlelight dinners, and there's going to be this lovely little ambient light on the horizon as the sun sets over the Okavango Delta or the Masai Mara, you name it, and you can get shots like this really each and every night of the trip. They really rely on a few things. One is that there is a really good light source, and we're actually going to talk about this next, so I'll just progress here. You can even do, around fire pits. It didn't have to be one of these elaborate dinners, but what you're going to look for is some sort of interesting scene with some light sources. And what that means is really I'm prioritizing like real deal light, like a lantern, a spotlight, a fire, candlelight, something other than just the ambient light from the environment, because that, A, it's going to give you something really, really great to focus on, and B, it's going to provide a little bit of context, something interesting to your photo. So this is one of these things, if you are taking notes, you're just going to have to blindly write it down, or you can always come back to this presentation on our website later and check out these settings. But these are pretty classic sort of nighttime blue hour, as we sometimes call it, with a beautiful blue sky, kind of dusk shots. As you're looking at setting your camera in manual mode, F4, 5-second exposure plus or minus, moderate ISO 400. Get your camera on that tripod, or find a really sturdy bench, or put it on a rock wall, something that's going to allow it to be absolutely still for those 5 seconds or more or less. You are going to focus and then compose the shot. And as a pro tip, if you focus on the light source here, it's going to make it so much easier, so much quicker for your focusing. It's very, very difficult to focus on the distance here, to focus on dark trees. Cameras rely on contrast to focus. So if you're not doing that, if you're not focusing on the light, you're gonna have a hard time. Go back and adjust as needed. So keep on going back and checking out these settings. You know, maybe it turned out a little bit too dark in your photo. Go back to some of those earlier lessons about increasing that light. Remember, you got to get enough light in that bucket of water, so to speak. If you need to fill it up more with more light, the way you do so is either keeping it on longer or increasing the size of that aperture, which you can either get from these presentations here or having that handy cheat sheet around with you. And just keep on taking photos. Wash, rinse, and repeat, so to speak. Okay, so we've all seen this before. We've all been here, not just in Africa, but really any sort of wildlife trip. We are rumbling along either in a boat or a Jeep, or we're hiking along or walking along, and your naturalist guide spots something in the distance. And you're like, how in the world, what are you even seeing? I even with my binoculars, I can't see it. And it's, you know, a little cheetah sitting, and there's actually a little cub down in here in the grasses that you want to get, you want to capture, you want to photograph that. But gosh, it's far away. Like, this is the shot, even with your biggest telephoto, the most firepower you have, so to speak, for your lenses. What do? Do you just set your camera down and say, nah, forget about it? No, there are things you can do that will ultimately get you this shot. So the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna assess the lighting, okay? Is this an early morning shot? Is this a dusk shot? Is this a night shot? Because the proficiency of the shot, the transformative power to turn that distant animal into this closer animal via cropping is gonna rely very, very much on a big F number, which lets in less light, a very fast shutter, that's a very fast faucet turn on, which doesn't let it a lot in the light. And you're gonna need, maybe most importantly, a very low ISO, because you wanna preserve the quality at most, or as much as possible. So all these things signal low light. This means that that trickle of water is going to be on. There's no magical unicorn to increase the ISO. So if you do have an early morning shot and you're needing to take a shot like this, it's going to be infinitely harder. Fortunately, you know, there are a lot of times on safari that you're seeing great stuff in wonderful light. I mean, there are no canopies, there's no covers, there's no big jungle that you're photographing within. We'll get to that in a second. So you're often faced with a lot of light, and that gives you all the capability to shoot at a moderately big F number, a reasonably fast shutter speed, and a very, very low ISO. What this does is it preserves as much focus. So you're actually getting a little bit wider slice of focus in case you don't get quite the perfect shot. I mean, let's go back to this. Let's go back to this here in a second. Hold on. So look at this. I mean, think about your camera's focusing square and your focusing mechanism. It's probably bigger than the size of this cheetah's head. So how do you focus on it? Well, it's very, very hard. You're not going to nail it each and every time. So having that wider depth of field is quite important, just to give yourself a little bit of room for error if you don't hit that cheetah in perfect focus. The shutter speed is very, very important, because you want, you know, you're essentially photographing at the very maximum extent of your lens and can be cropping in even further. So you need to have that fast shutter speed for any sort of hand movement, because you're limiting that angle of focus quite pronounced. And an ISO, you want the highest quality possible, because you are going to be cropping in after the fact. So the difference in that previous photo in this is really just cropping in on the computer after the trip, or on the trip if you brought your laptop. And take several shots, because your focusing is going to be quite variable. You're going to notice very, very big differences in one shot to the next in terms of what's in focus. You can take 10 shots and one will be that perfect one, and you can crop in and save the shot. Now, with all this, there are certainly times that things aren't way, way far away. This is not the same cheetah sighting. This is the same day, but different cheetah sighting. And you just know, like, you just can't get any closer than this, and your lens won't reach anymore, but you just know you want to fill the frame with this animal. It's the exact same thing. It's all the exact same principles. You want that low ISO to preserve quality. If you have a very high ISO and you start cropping in on the computer to, like, let's say 50 or 100% of the actual file size, you're going to notice that grain so much more than if you didn't crop. So remember, these are all techniques for prioritizing cropping a photo more than you think you should, but it's going to give you the photo that you ultimately want. Okay. So I told you we're going to move on to Africa's jungles, where there is a little bit of canopy. We are going to be faced with a lot of distractions, a lot of vines, a lot of trees, a lot of stuff going on. So this is where it's going to kind of pick up on a few other webinars I've talked about. We are dipping back into the review of 101, so to speak. As we go into the last few slides of this presentation, make sure if you do have questions on anything I talked about today or anything I haven't talked about, definitely submit those, and Kendall will get those asked to me here just a bit. But a few other topics before we wrap up. So photographing in Africa's jungles. Well, again, it's a similar thing about cropping, seeing the photo as you want it in the end. This photo began like this, okay? So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to minimize all of these distractions. There's light and dark, there's harsh shadows and bright spots, there's all this stuff in the background. And I'm photographing dead middle because I'm using that center pointed autofocus each and every time. So a lot of it is about seeing the resulting photo. It's breaking the scene down into components. If I'm faced with a lot of distractions and a lot of mottled light because there are trees and there is full sun and it's shining different parts, I want to break it down into just the area that I want, which is this photo here. A few tips. Focus on the eyes. So that's something I hound on constantly. You got to focus somewhere in the scene. This is usually why I have it in the center before I crop. Focus on the eyes. Get a shallow depth of field. Remember that portrait mode I'm a huge fan of, whether it's with your smartphone, whether it's with your camera using a very shallow depth of field, using those low F numbers. That also helps with letting a lot of light in, something that's very, very much needed photographing in the jungles of Africa. And then choosing your background. This is a really, really important thing. There are a lot of critters in Africa when you are on foot. We've kind of moved up into the Rwanda, Uganda area in this little virtual journey where you can photograph these golden monkeys and you can move around. You are on foot. They're only about yay big and there's dozens, maybe even hundreds in a single troop. So asking yourself, what do you want in the background here? Do you want a nice green background or do you want more of this brown in the scene? And this is where it gets a lot into the artsiness of photography is, don't just snap the photo and move on. Think about, well, how can I make this photo better? How can I actually make the background, which is a dominant part of the scene, it's at least 1/3 of the whole surface area. How can I find, an even color? How can I find an even lighting? How can I move around so the background, even though it's totally blurred, because again, we're using that shallow depth of field to draw focus in on the eyes, how can I choose my background? Choosing your background is a huge, super important point for that photography of Africa's jungles and its creatures within. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about photographing the landscapes of Africa. Again, we talked about this quite a bit in the 101 talk, but nevertheless, there are a few things here. I like to look at landscape photography, as you need, most of the time, if you possibly can, you find a good background and a good foreground. The background is like your scene. The foreground is like what is right in front of the camera. What could be, your subject. So the way I like to look at it is I kind of mentally assign a scale of like 1 to 10 to the background and the foreground. If you're photographing a beautiful mountain range, say you're at the base camp of Mount Everest, and it's just the whole thing is Everest. That's like a 10 out of 10 for background. That's pretty darn impressive. So what that means is you don't necessarily need as much of a foreground element. You don't need to have a really compelling foreground element. Similarly, if you have some great thing in the foreground, like it might be an animal, it might be a monkey, et cetera, you don't need to have that background quite as distinct, quite as impressive. So a lot of times with scenics and a lot of times with landscape photography, we're faced with scenes that seem really impressive to us in the moment, very big landscapes, they're expansive, interesting clouds, but it's not necessarily a 10 out of 10, maybe like a 5 out of 10, a 6 out of 10, a 7 out of 10. So what I often look for and I advise is start looking in your foreground. Is there anything that you can draw into the scene that might be a really good thing to add? Like it's an additive process, great background and great foreground makes a great landscape shot. So even though this is not a very compelling foreground, it's still quite interesting. It's a really distinct color. It's a distinct leading line. You know how much I love leading lines. And it just adds to that overall scene where if we didn't have this, it'd still be great, but it wouldn't be quite as good. Very, very important point to make there, that additive process of having a foreground element that adds to the background quality. Do not forget about storytelling in travel photography. This is something we talk about more in 101, but I just wanted to reiterate it. Oftentimes people really hate when people step in front of them and take photos. I actually told her to get in front of me because I wanted to take this cool shot. But do not hesitate. If someone steps in front of you, that's a great time to get a photo of them with the animal, of them in the landscape, especially if they have a camera. That's such a powerful put yourself here shot, even though they may not do it or may not have intentionally done it, even though you may be a little bit annoyed if someone stepped in front of your shot. Use that as an opportunity to make that great travel shot and great storytelling. When you're telling your friends, yeah, that was exactly what we were doing. We were there, we were that close to the rhino. It really provides a lot of context. Do not dismay when you see critters like this little leopard completely enshrouded in bushes. So we waited so patiently for this little guy to come out and he never did. But nevertheless, I love this photography because you can actually showcase how alluring these animals are, how scarce they are, how protected they are, how it's really not, you don't just go on safari and expect to see absolutely everything. It's part of the storytelling, embracing that, using some of these elements like this kind of framing here. You can do a lot of different stuff, even if you're made to make lemonade out of lemons per se. And then last but not least, getting vehicles in your photographs, more of that storytelling, more of that put yourself here. Another thing that people really get annoyed about is when a vehicle crosses in front of their path, crosses in front of their shot on safari. That's why I love the safaris that we do, is we rarely even see another vehicle the whole day, but a lot of other companies will put many vehicles out in these big national parks. Nevertheless, even if you do have a vehicle in your shot, use it to your advantage. Use it as that kind of storytelling element. Don't just put the camera down and wait for the vehicle to move. Use it as part of that foreground element. It can create some really captivating shots. And I would be remiss if I didn't put the rule of thirds somewhere in the presentation. I don't think I've ever missed a single photography presentation without talking about the rule of thirds. I've talked about it ad nauseum for the last 35 episodes of Photography Daily Dose, but nevertheless, you can see how you take things in the landscape, in the element, and put it on these crosshairs. It makes for a much more compelling photo. With that, I digress. Folks, shameless plug for our photo tutorial website. You can learn a lot more than what I talk about today. I write articles very often. You can see a lot of articles static up here, and new articles are coming up every couple of weeks. So tune in, bookmark it, and don't forget to download your cheat sheet. And I think now is a great time for questions, Kendall. Thanks so much for paying attention, guys.
Great, thank you, Court. We've got a lot of good questions for you, but first I'd like to remind everyone watching, if you have a question for Court, you can submit those in the questions field in your control panel. All right, first question. This one came up a couple times actually. Would you recommend teleconverters or extenders for the Canon 100 to 400?
I don't. Yeah, I don't. So they add stops onto a lens that already has a pretty high aperture. So let's just take for example, so what you really want to do is you want to turn your 400 into an 800, right? So at a 2x extender, you're going to lose 2 stops, meaning that you lose twice as much light. So that means that the exact same shot at exact same shutter speed is going to be knocked down by 2. So like, let's say you, well, let me step back. So what that's going to do is it's going to up your aperture rating to a minimum of f11. Okay, so if you're at f5.6, one stop is f8, the second stop is f11. What that means, so that's all great. Like, you don't have to worry about that too much because, you know, having a wider depth of field isn't the worst thing in the world. But going back to that faucet analogy, that means that you will only get 1/4 of the light coming through that you once had. And that's very challenging. So that's where, you know, these big prime lenses that are like f2.8 throughout, you pay a lot of money. It's a lot of glass. It's big, it's heavy. But that's where, you know, if you have a 400 f2.8 lens, you can afford that 2-stop reduction because that turns that f2.8 into an f5.6, the same thing that we're using with my Canon camera right here. And that's okay. You know, f5.6 still lets in a decent bit of light. That, in addition to the fact that it does decrease the quality. Now, the new Mark II version of the 100 to 400 of a lot of these cameras, from Nikon to Sony, all these are pretty darn good, but I personally think it's unacceptable. So it's wishy-washy. I could see some people making a counter argument and saying why they like it. I personally don't recommend it. I'd say use those techniques that I showed you about the ISO 100, the slightly faster shutter speed, looking for light, planning for the crop. And that's what you're going to do with the 100 to 400 to make your subject material a little bit bigger by cropping after the fact.
Okay. So if it's sunny, do you want to use white balance? It says, don't you want to set white balance to sun? If not, why?
Yeah, so it's rather subjective, actually. So remember, if you're shooting on RAW, you can change the white balance of your photo after you shoot it, meaning you can go on the computer when you're downloading things, and there's little drop-down menus that say you can go to cloudy, to auto, to sun, to all the different presets. Technically, what white balance is doing by putting it on sunny on a sunny day is it's saying, yes, there is a lot of yellow, almost orange sun beaming down. It's casting a yellowish hue to everything. I want to put a white balance in that adds blue to the scene that reduces the yellow value of my shots. So you see what I'm saying? So you're telling your camera there's too much yellow in the scene by putting it on sunny, and the sunny setting actually injects more blue into your shot. So what you'll see, again, a great thing to go out and test is comparing side by side. You will get either a warmer photo by having more yellow or a cooler photo by having more blue. By the book, technically, yes, that's why it's called sunny, is you should put it on sunny for sunny days. But I personally, my style is I like warmer photographs. I like to have that little bit of a yellow cast. I think it's very, very appropriate on Safari. You can see how, this photo has kind of like that warm look to it, a little bit more yellow. It's just my personal preference. The only time I ever use a sunny setting personally is when I'm in the Arctic and I want my photos to take on an exaggerated cool look, kind of like that icy blue look. I find that if you do it on most wildlife trips, most safaris, usually what sunny setting does is it actually makes your photo a little bit more drab, and you're gonna have to saturate it after the fact. But again, this is where the artistry comes in. Is you could totally do it and you can show me a photo and I'll probably love it because it's your vision, it's your interpretation of it. There's no right or wrong way to do it, for sure.
All right, and sort of related to that, what are your suggestions for photographing in harsh light with moving subjects?
Harsh light with moving subjects. Well, so that's kind of a twofold question. One is that harsh light means a lot of light, usually. And that means you can do all the fast shutter, you can do the wide depth of field. So you're not limited by light. So there's not a lot of technical aspect of that. Really, what I'm after doing is when I have harsh light, I either want to embrace the harsh light and I want to turn it into a high contrast scene. Sometimes I take the photo, I shoot the photo, and the first thing I do on the computer is turn it into black and white. Do I like that? Is the harsh contrast really, really conducive to a dramatic black and white shot? And oftentimes it is. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use more telephoto than I normally would. Now, if you don't have any more telephoto, if you're at the extent of your range, there's not much you can do, but you want to minimize the amount of that modeled light. So if you have a big scene and you have light and dark all on the fringes, you want to kind of zero in. So maybe there's still harsh contrast, but it's one big bright spot and one big dark spot. Whereas if you have it kind of all over the place, it really plays tricks with the eyes, and I think it's very, very distracting. So even if there's harsh contrast, minimizing the number of zones of your frame, think about my little webcam as the whole frame and the various zones, just trying to condense it so there's only a few zones of intense black or white. That's kind of my go-to. It's a tough situation. That's why we do generally like earlier morning, later afternoon stuff, because that lower light angle usually makes for softer shadows.
Okay. And do you have any tips for dealing with reflections from plane windows? Would a polarizer help?
It's a good question. I don't know if I've ever experimented with that. I know exactly what you're talking about. I have not tried a polarizer. My guess is that it's not going to be a super panacea kind of solution. I think it might help a little bit. So here's what you do for plane windows. And this actually goes for any sort of windows. Let's say you're at an aquarium. Let's say you're at some sort of wildlife conservation area. Is you really want to get as close as possible to that window as you can. So what I'll sometimes do, obviously you take a test shot, and if you're finding that there's, for whatever reason, the angle of the sun, the thickness of the window, maybe it's got some scratches on it or it hasn't been totally cleaned, the closer you get to that window, the less it's gonna actually impact the photo, because the focus is gonna be so far beyond that window, you'll find some very, very scratched up windows actually having zero effect on your shot. What you want to do is you want to have your lens completely square to the window. So you don't want to be at an angle where light could bounce at some sort of angle. You want to be head on, 90 degrees, a full tangent. And then if you have, so I usually shoot my lens hood on because I want to minimize thumbprints on it or scratches or any sort of dust flying in. So the lens hood is really great for that. But sometimes you can take that lens hood off and stick that lens right against the pane of the glass, and it'll get your best shot of all. Be careful with it because that's exposing your glass directly to something else and you don't want it to scratch. But nevertheless, that's kind of your fail-safe. I have seen, and you can Google this or look on some sort of website, B&H Photo or Amazon, they make these special adapters for the tip of your lens that's actually like this big black kind of like fabric box that actually goes around your lens. So you can be a few inches away from the window and it completely blocks out all the reflections coming from behind you. I've never used one, but they actually make a piece of equipment just for that issue you're facing. I've found my previous tips and tricks work 19 times out of 20, about 95% of the time.
Great, thank you. So someone had a question about memory cards. There's so many out there. They want to know, is it worth it to go for the higher class, the higher megabytes?
That's a brilliant question. Short answer, yes. You'll be surprised how expensive the really good memory cards get. You can see one memory card that's the exact same size, 64 gigabytes, and then the intro is 20 bucks, and then the high end is 220 bucks. So here, I'm not going to tell you that you should or shouldn't do it, but here's why they cost more. Is that the read and write speed, meaning like the amount of time it takes for the camera to read what's on the card, and more importantly, how long it takes for the camera to write the data to the card, boosts tremendously with the better cards. And you'll see that it's right on the card or it's on the packaging. It's usually written and explained in an MB/S, megabytes per second. What that means is if you are shooting, and it's especially important for wildlife photography, and it's especially important if you have a good camera that has a high frame rate. Because what you want is when you go on burst mode, you hold that shutter down and you're photographing this amazing sequence of a cheetah just careening across the savannah, and you want to get every little tiny movement, and you have 100 photos to choose from. That's the greatest luxury. It's a good thing. Your camera can only take as many photos as the motor in your camera to shoot, but then more importantly, your memory card might not be able to write it and actually save it fast enough if you get one of the cheaper cards. So okay, don't worry about anything I just said. If you can get a memory card that's at least 120 megabytes a second or faster, you're in pretty good shape. A lot of the really, really primo ones these days are because of things like 4K video, and some of these cameras are able to shoot at like 20 or 30 frames a second. And at 30 megabytes a photo, 20 photos a second, that's like 600 megabytes a second. That requires a very, very fancy card. So yeah, I think, if you are in the point where you're spending primo dollars for a good camera and primo dollars for a great safari, the relative cost of an expensive memory card is worth it.
All right, great. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Well, thanks, Kendall, and thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you learned a few things. We're going to keep it rolling from there. I've got all sorts of new webinars going. And then just as a quick heads up, I will be on air again tomorrow, a little bit different time at 2:30 Mountain Time, talking about how travel can save the world. Wow, it's a big topic. It's not just me, it's some of the most respected folks in the industry alongside, including Jim Sano, Ben Bressler, some of our best expedition leaders. So check that out as well. It's listed on our Daily Dose website. It's the same thing, you got to register for it. I would love to see you there. It's going to be a really, really great presentation. That's tomorrow.
Great. Thank you, Court. This was a pleasure as always, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for the webinar Court just mentioned. And right before that, we have, during our normal time slot, an update on how our trips have been running this summer in Yellowstone. We're going to hear from 3 of our staff members who are highly involved in the planning and execution of running those trips this summer. So tune in for that as well. So thank you again for joining us today. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.